Hey, it's time for Pate State All-Americans, Defensive Edition. Let's name some All-Americans this year. Now, we don't go about it necessarily like the AP does. They do their own thing. I care about what I think you're going to do this year. So I don't care if you had monster stats last year. If I think you're going to blow up this year, you're an All-American in my book. So first up, defensive line. Got to go with Jared Verse down at Florida State. He had first-round potential last year, guys. He could have gone to the draft last year. He came back. It was a really big deal around Tallahassee and around college football. Jordan Travis, him coming back at quarterback was another big deal. All the tools to dominate. You pretty well know Jared Verse. I don't have to tell you a lot about him. Tyler Davis up at Clemson, also first-round defensive lineman on the Pate State preseason All-American team. He's been 3 times All-ACC. He was an All-American last year, 39 starts, a quintessential piece of what you would expect along the Clemson front. JT Tuimoloau at Ohio State has shown flashes. He took over the Penn State game. As dominant a defensive performance as you've probably seen in a long time. But that wasn't consistent across the board. He's one of the guys I'm talking about this year, actually, when I say, hey, Ohio State doesn't have an elite quarterback. They don't have C.J. Stroud. I wonder if there are some guys on that team that understand that means they have to up their level of play consistently for them to be 11-1 or 12-0. That guy right there is capable of being the best player in college football. I'm not kidding you. That's what kind of talent he has. If it's put together over the course of 12, 13, 14, 15 games, that guy, he's going to make himself a millionaire either way, but he can make Ohio State a national champion in the process. And Michael Williams down at Georgia, by way of Hardaway High School in Columbus, Georgia, I think that he will explode on national radars this year. He is not a guy who has monster numbers because he has not been featured at Georgia yet. He will be featured this year. Chop Robinson up at Penn State, defensive lineman. These are the kinds of guys that you need to model your life and your caliber of play after if you want to be a Pate State defensive All-American. Let's go to the linebacker position so I can talk to you about the best defensive player in the SEC. His name is, I believe at least, Harold Perkins down at LSU. First team All-SEC as a true freshman. Look, I've had 3 coaches tell me that's the best defensive player in the SEC, and you've got a grand total of 1 year of him playing football at 18 years old. It's ridiculous. Just took over games last year. You had to account for him every play if you're an offensive coordinator, and he's a true freshman. Sideline to sideline, ultra physical, plugs the gap, plays the run, plays the pass, does everything you would want him to do. Jamon Dumas-Johnson at Georgia. Also a first-team All-American at linebacker for Pate State. He led Georgia in tackles for loss last year. He started all 15 games for Kirby Smart. I mentioned Kirby Smart the same way I would mention Saban. If they trust you that much defensively, it means something to me. A lot of times they've just found guys who are dependable. Most of the time they found guys who are dependable and also total freak athletes, and Dumas-Johnson is both. Number 3, there's no particular order here, but the third player I'm talking about, Dallas Turner at Alabama. I think I've told the story a couple of times, but I'll tell you once more. I remember back when we were coming into last year and Will Anderson had all the preseason accolades, and I had an offensive coach reach out and say, Will Anderson may be everyone's preseason All-American. He's the second best defensive player Saban's got. Dallas Turner's the best, and Dallas Turner is going to be the focal point of Bama's edge rush this year. They've got half a dozen former 5-star guys in that room. Dallas Turner's the best among them, number 15 there. And I think that he's probably already on a lot of national radars. He's got game takeover potential too. Abdul Carter at Penn State. Big numbers last year? Not so much. He had big numbers as a spot starter. He didn't start every game last year. This is a guy who would not be on a lot of people's first team because a lot of people do the double dip. They do the postseason All-American team, but then they also judge the preseason All-American team off last year's numbers, which makes no sense to me. I think Abdul Carter is going to be a freak alien-like player this year at linebacker for Penn State. He's got a chance to take over games. Everyone on the first team has a chance to take over games. So I love all those guys. At corner, got to go right back down to Tuscaloosa. I think Kool-Aid McKinstry is the best cornerback in college football. He was second in FBS as a returner last year also. And that gets us into that really fun debate where I get someone walks in and says, I don't think you should play your starters on special teams. That same person says, well, it's about offense, defense, and special teams. like there are equal thirds of a football game, which I believe, by the way. But then that same person will devalue one of those thirds by saying, let's not play starters on special teams. No game's ever been lost on special teams, So anyway, go say it to Nick Saban. Ask him what he thinks about playing starters on special teams. You don't even see Kool-Aid a ton in Bama games because most folks don't even throw at him. But when they do, it usually turns out well for Bama. Kalen King up at Penn State, they did throw at him a lot last year, but it also didn't go well. He was number 1 in Big Ten in passes defended last year. He was an All-American. He was all Big Ten. He has been dominant in fall camp. They don't throw the ball to his side of the field very often. And like I said, he and Kool-Aid are the kinds of guys that if they played in the NFL right now, they'd be able to hold their own in the NFL. They'll be there next year. So Kalen King's another one. Will Johnson at Michigan is a first-team Pate State All-American. And this is going to get some pushback because Will Johnson didn't have monster numbers last year. I would encourage you to go watch the Ohio State game. He did have monster numbers in that one. He was a freshman All-American. He appeared in all 14 games last year. The stats in 2022 don't scream preseason All-American. I think his stats this year will warrant, or validate rather, him being a preseason All-American, and that's all I care about. So, love Kool-Aid, Kalen King, Will Johnson. Those are my corners. But that's not all the secondary is made of, is it? Let's go back to safety for just a second. Malachi Starks this time last year was the talk of Georgia's fall camp. He's a true freshman at the time, and I didn't tell you this. So Starks was so good in fall camp last year. I forgot to tell you this story until just now. Malachi Starks was so good in fall camp, they were actively trying to suppress information about him. Like, Kirby didn't want information about 24 there out. They didn't want folks to know how good he was. Well, then the Oregon game happened. That right there, if you're watching on YouTube, that is his first college football game. Amazing player. Amazing player. So he's a preseason All-American for me this year. Led in pass breakups. He was first team All-SEC, started all 14 games. Let's go to Miami because Cam Kitchens is another one on the first team for me. He was an All-American last year. He led Miami in tackles with 59 of them. He will be a national name this year. His play is already at that level. I think because Miami was bad, people didn't pay much attention to him. Cam Kitchens is absolutely Pate State All-American material. Now, let me tell you what I almost did. But it takes a brave man to do this, and I was not that brave man tonight. I regretted not putting Malachi Starks on my preseason All-American team last year, even though he'd never played a college football game. And I almost put Caleb Downs on my preseason All-American team this year because he is basically Malachi Starks just over at Alabama. The way they're talking about him over at Alabama really sounds like the way they talked about Starks this past year. I didn't do it again. I didn't put a true freshman on the All-American team. I already know I'm going to get claims of homerism for too many SEC guys on this list, but I almost did it. And the reason I'm telling you that is because if he balls out this year, I want all the credit with none of the blame if he only starts half a dozen games.